Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to be going over some of the content for your midterm. And so you can consider this to be a midterm review. I will be posting this on our website, and I will send this out through the Blackboard announcements. But you'll want to make sure that you're kind of putting this in perspective of the work that you've done so far. So this really kind of draws from your major readings that you have thus far in two kind of ways. One is that you're going to be building on the knowledge that you gained from the first section, and I'll go over that in the second half of this presentation. And then you're going to try to bring that into relation with these major readings. Now, these all come from the Law and Identity Reader, but if you needed to, you might be able to find these in various places online. For instance, you could Google the Declaration of Independence. So you want to try to get access to these however you can, for those of you who kind of need to reread things a few times. But I'm now going to provide just kind of like what is the main thing I want you to understand from these. Now you need to be able to cite to those readings, but again, try to put it in the context that I'm giving you here, and then make those citations, say like in Marbury versus Madison, for example. So what those readings are really getting at is kind of two categories, right? The one I have here is yellow, and the other one in kind of the salmon pink color. So both those first kind of readings, the Declaration of Independence and Federalist Paper 47, talk about kind of what are the ideals of democracy, or what are the ideals of a legal constitution. And so obviously in the Declaration of Independence, what you're thinking about is equality, right? All men are created equal. We're endowed by nature's God. And this idea is that equality of condition must be secured through political organization. In other words, because human beings will take advantage of one another, it's only through politics, it's only through a governmental organization like a constitution that you can kind of guarantee those rights of equality. Unfortunately, right, that ideal is kind of ruined by the real experience of humans, right? And so this is kind of the interpretation, that's what that word exegesis means, the interpretation of this document of what it means to be happy, of what it means to be free, is widely different. So when Lincoln is taking over as president and begins the emancipatory process, you'll remember that there were very vocal people who said, listen, slaves aren't equal. And so it was Lincoln who kind of had to reframe this debate and try to get both sides that were really angry and really frustrated with each other, one saying that slavery was allowed and was legal and was moral, and the other side saying that no, this was a complete contradiction of the law, and that interpretation meant that we were all have to be included in participatory democracy. So Lincoln said, it's like one person working out in a field, or one person going out hunting, or one person, working all day, laboring, and the other person benefiting from that labor but not doing the work themselves. And he said, that can never be right. That will always be wrong. And because I won't be a slave, I won't be a slaveholder either. And his point here is that you can't have it both ways, right? You can't have absolute liberty, the freedom to enslave someone else, and have equality. And so, the point there was just showing that, in the reality, the way people interpret the ideal can lead to conflict, and then you have to kind of resolve that conflict. So one theory that you can use to understand this gap between the ideal and the real is the behavioral theory of organizations. And this mainly comes out of brain science and how people are affected by their surroundings. So attention shifts with emotional connections to the means instead of the rational ends. So for example, let's say that your goal is to pass this class with an A+. You might lose sight of that, right? Because you're in the COVID epidemic, right? You might be out of work. You might be targeted by racial or gender violence. And so you'll focus on the means, right, of getting through your day, of securing your assignments through Blackboard, of emailing your professors, right? You might start to believe over time that those activities will get you an A, but that's not what will get you an A, right? What will get you an A is whether you're able to understand and apply the material. So people have a hard time, humans have a hard time of separating the process, the means of something, and the ends or the outcome of something. And in groups, people start to identify largely with the process. So right now you have Democrats are largely contesting the Supreme Court nominee because of the process, whereas the Republicans are largely trying to push through their Supreme Court candidate for the process of politics. And notice that neither side is focused on the rational ends of government, on the rational ends of equality, on the rational ends of what a good Supreme Court justice should be. And so this is kind of a present modern day example of how people tend to start to get biased against the ideal because they think they have real interests that are in violation of some process. On the other hand, if you think about the ideal of the Federalist Paper 47 and how the courts should be the place to resolve these kind of political conflicts, in other words, the Supreme Court could actually intervene in this Supreme Court nomination, we get back to, yes, that's a lovely ideal, but in reality, if we look at the Marbury versus Madison case, the Supreme Court said, no, we don't want to get involved here. And very similar to today, you had the Republican Party and the Federalist Party both, basically at each other's throats, just like they were in the Civil War. And so you have like this reality of politics where people start to look after their own interests. And the system we have is we elevate two people. So in that time, you had John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who hated each other in the political fight they were in. And they represented that kind of hatred and that anger, and representing one side representing abolition or getting rid of slavery, and the other side saying, no, we need to have the liberty, to do what we want, even if it's bad. And so this is what, if we thought about it that way, like how can you justify that idea that it's okay to have liberty, even if you're harming another human being? Or, Justice Scalia tries to explain this in originalism. He's saying that, it is evil, but it's the lesser evil. In other words, he believes that if you let a system run by a majority, then you will see kind of the political process. It'll be ugly and it might not be, great, but it's the same ugliness that existed in 1776. And so the goal of the courts in that case is to try to interpret the political differences through that original document. On the other hand, you'll see that, if I compare this to the behavioral theory, this is kind of probably too ideal and naive on Scalia's part. And that's because these political differences are constructed, right? So the Republicans and the Democrats didn't go pick these differences. These are the differences that they already had. And so they pick the party based on these differences. So, one side believes that Black Lives Matter. The other side believes that they don't feel like saying that, and maybe only their life matters. And so you see the interpretation of ideals like equality, equity, justice, etc., are going to matter tremendously based on those political differences. And so those are the two kind of rules I want you to remember. The equality of condition must be secured through political organization, but attention shifts with emotional connections to the means instead of rational ends. And that political differences are constructed, so the interpretation of how those differences matter is always political. So if we now apply this back to the research you've done so far on justice, I just wanted you to see that I'm trying to bring you all into conversation with each other without having the luxury of getting you all to have conversations in the classroom. And based on the extra credit Zoom opportunities I've given, it's obviously very hard for you all to get in one space at one time. But you'll see that the overwhelming majority of folks, decided to look at race issues. It's not surprising. It's up a little bit, right? I do this kind of work each semester, and race is usually about 28-30%, and so you see there's a bit of a bump. People are more interested, I think, probably because Black Lives Matter, and for some other reasons. So I think, on the other hand, like you want to think about these things in relationship to one another. So, Black Lives Matter, for those of you who have been doing that research, is a social movement that is at intersectionality, meaning that there is a connection to gender issues, to sexuality issues, and to economic issues. but that the primary kind of issue that they're thinking about is how and when black folks are targeted by the police state and what to do about that. Now, on the other hand, when you think about gender issues, it's, what I was trying to get you all to think about was, gender is one of those constructed differences in the same way that race is a constructed difference. And so we want to bring that into a relationship with other gender constructions, right? And because kind of the white male heteronormative view is most dominant in politics and media, we need to understand, like, what does that mean about how knowledge is constructed, especially as people are trying to resist the illegal use of power. And then I think that, ties nicely over to the problem with culture and law and whose culture should really count. And I think, this, and I put a side note on that, as if all cultures shouldn't count, right? Everybody should have a say. But in this country, it's evident that, again, white male heteronormative culture is the culture that seems to be always pushed. And even when challenged, people come up with amazing phrases like cancel culture, as if, if one person is removed from, there's this director or producer that, says all sorts of terrible things on a show publicly, right? It's in the public sphere. And now he's upset that people don't want him to make shows anymore. Well, that's not cancel culture, in my opinion. That's called a reckoning. That's called the consequences of your actions. And so we see this kind of playing out with migration, right? Like, this country was settled by people who migrated, and you could use the phrase, unlawfully. They dispossessed the people who were already here. And they executed many of them in order to take their land. It is then contradictory and hypocritical to suddenly erect walls and borders and say no one else can come here. So I think the problem with that you saw in that presentation is that that's illegal. It's illegal to stop people from migrating under the United States Constitution. And that was one of the main reasons for having the Declaration of Independence in the first place. So this then leads into, well, how come these powerful people get to say ridiculous things, make things up, they don't have to follow the law, they can change the law without having to go through the courts, and they can play games with the political structure. Meanwhile, women, black folks, and immigrants are being targeted. Well, my own experience as a white male is money matters, right? And so, poverty is one of those systems that keeps a lot of people out of power. And one way of gaining at least consciousness or awareness of how this system works is by going, to school. And so as a first-generation student in my own family, I found out a lot about injustice and kind of what you could do about it, in undergraduate and in community college. And then when I went on to law school is when I kind of started to see, like, okay, I see. Right, so it's illegal to abuse power. So all these folks are doing illegal things. But so many of us that were in a poor background didn't know, A, that those things were illegal, and B, what we could do about it. And so you start to see that, like, with just a little bit of reorganizing and strategy, when the resources kind of get shared, that suddenly promotes this idea of equity. But you'd have to bring all of these things together in order for that to become, I think, clear. And it's obviously a lot easier to do in the classroom, but I'm hoping that just seeing that, each group of students has been kind of doing injustice work, and now we're going to compare it to the ideals and the reality of the legal system, will help you get a little bit clearer picture about how these things are interrelated. And some of you have actually written about this already, so I think some of you are getting there. Now, my point here on this, kind of just to prep you for the midterm, is to think there's such a thing as legal resistance. We live in an age right now where certain politicians and certain people in power are using the media to suggest that if you resist, you're being illegal. This is not a new trick. They've done this over and over and over again. But let me just kind of, make it clear. Under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, you have two rights to resist. One is under the Equal Protection Clause, and the other one is under the Due Process Clause. And the Due Process Clause guarantees a procedure. So again, we were a little bit too focused on procedure, I think, in the Supreme Court nominations and some other of these, even elections and voting. So the second part of that due process claim under the 14th Amendment is substantive. So if your vote is being discounted, that's a violation of the fundamental law. So you don't need to really think so much about the process itself, whether it's mail-in balloting, whether it's voter ID laws. Those things are certainly bad, and they need to be examined at the political level. But at the legal level, that's undermining the substance of the law, right? The goal of the law, the ideal of the law, is for everyone to participate, and could be argued under the 14th Amendment regardless of citizenship. Although there will be qualifications to run for office, but there's no indication whatsoever that you shouldn't be allowed to vote. And this is where you see kind of like felons getting the right to vote back, and try to remember that African Americans had to protest for 150 years to get their right to vote. Women had to protest for 70 years to get their right to vote. So you could kind of see this as kind of legal resistance as how people get to be in the political process in the first place. So that should kind of drive you to this question of like, well, where is this coming from? Well, there's the right to control. In other words, there was the whole point of having a constitutional government, a political organization, was that it had the right to control us by our own consent. And there's a lot of research that goes into political science about how do I know whether I have the consent of the governed. If I'm doing something to you that's against your interests, I don't see why you would say that, oh, this government is great, I'm going to run out and vote. So that's where this right to resist comes in. It's been a historical protection against the abuse of power, of arbitrary and capricious action, meaning if the police force is in fact targeting black males in particular, if women are not getting equal pay in the workforce, if immigrants are being treated at a substandard or as subhumans, and if those without economic means, right, without being wealthy, cannot participate in the political process, then that is a violation of the Constitution, and we have the right to resist against that abuse of power. The problem is that, like to think about it in an abstract is always, I think, a little bit easier than a concrete situation. So what I'm doing for your midterm is giving you a story, giving you a hypothetical. And in real life, this is the same thing, and this is what lawyers and constitutional lawyers especially do, is you have to determine what's the issue in the case. Now, oftentimes there's more than one issue, and I will point out now that each of you, are going to be tempted to want to solve all of the issues. But you need to think about which one can you pick and explain the best, right? And so my suspicion is that you'll be able to explain the one that is most closely related to the injustice research that you've done thus far. And so you just kind of need to think about this idea that, yes, sure, the government does have the right to control, but that's by the consent of the governed. So in these kind of politically divisive times, then the right to resist becomes pretty obvious. But trying to figure out which one is the right to control and which one is the right to resist is the nature of the midterm. And so I want to see how well you can apply your learning, and this is the kind of formula you'll want to use. So you need to start by explaining which legal issue you are arguing. Is it an injustice against race or racism? Is it an injustice against gender or sexuality? Is it an injustice against migrants? Or is it an injustice that is, economic or poverty in nature? And then you want to think about what's the legal principle are you using? Are you using the equal opportunity idea? Are you thinking about social justice? Are you thinking about the right to participation? Are you thinking about the right to resist arbitrary and capricious use of power? And then you want to finally try to make the case for your client to a judge. So think of the person that experiences the injustice as your, imagine you're a lawyer or a judge, and this is the person you're representing. And then try to use legal language that you've learned in class so far. And so legal language is the one that comes up in those readings and comes up in the research that you've done. And then if you want to get an A on this midterm, you're going to need to cite to those readings. So you need to say something like in Brown versus Board of Education, in the Miller case, et cetera. You need to make these connections very clear, or say, as Bell Hooks explained, and say it that way. And then finally, here's the grading rubric for you to consider. And so I wanted to start over here. Like, you're going to get, somewhere between a C- to an F, or a non-passing grade for those of you in the Justice Academy, because you didn't cite to the readings like I just explained. You'll say an opinion that's unsupported by the evidence. You'll say, I think the whole legal system is corrupt, and so that's your answer to the hypothetical. And your opinion will be based on just your point of view. For those of you who do a little bit better, it's because you're able to cite to the readings, but you kind of applied it incorrectly. So you might say something like in Scott versus Sanford, but then you say it wrong, right? You get the wrong part of it. So that makes me think that you didn't quite understand how that case applied. You might say something like, the Declaration says we're all equal. Well, it didn't quite say exactly that, right? So you're kind of close, but you're just not quite getting the point to the legal principle. And then your opinion will be based on a similar point of view that you found in a reading. So it's like you went through the readings, you found 9 of them that disagreed with you, but you found one that agreed with you. So you said, I'm gonna pick that one. So that doesn't show me that you're really understanding all of the readings that you were assigned. It seems that you kind of picked your favorite one. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's C level work, that's C plus work. You're passing, but you're definitely not at B or A level. And then, a B- to an A- so because you cite the information correctly. So you'd say something like the Declaration of Independence has an ideal of equality. But you're going to think about this in an empirical way, right? And empirical research is based on the reality, right? So you'll say, although the Declaration of Independence has the ideal of equality, given the George Floyd case, or given the issues with LGBTQ, into today's society, this is not, clearly living up to the standard. And then you talk a little bit about the specific hypothetical. And then for an A to an A plus, it's because you show that you really understood these readings. So you might say something like, I really learned from the Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt was a champion of women's rights and of human rights, and that's what led to migrant rights. And now we need to kind of think about this within the context of the legal realities that people are going through when politicians and people in power abuse their authority. So you'd say something like, well, the ideal of equality is one narrative of law, the one most often on CSI and those other shows. That's not what people experience in real life because they're going through injustice. So like Scott versus Sanford, when Africans were seen as non-human and non-citizens, that is exactly the same kind of argument that people are making for undocumented immigrants, and largely for people who don't have enough money to participate in the political process and to participate in capitalism. So homeless folks, are seen as non-humans. And so that would show me that you're applying legal reasoning, and your conclusion would be based on a consistent application of the law and not simply your opinion about which political party you think is better or which way of looking at the world is better. You'd actually apply the readings of the law. And so if you did that, you'd certainly get an A+. And I know that this can be difficult, and I would love for everyone to get an A+, but this will give you a clearer idea of what you need to do after the midterm to boost your grade and to do well on the final exam. So I hope this was helpful. I think it is. I'll try to think of other ways to help you, and you'll have some more time to work on this as you get better at doing these readings and applying them.